It's 1941. A cold wind sweeps across an airfield somewhere in Europe. Dew glistens on the wings of machines that were supposed to change the course of history. The war is young, but the skies are already thick with smoke, ambition and fear. Men in leather flight jackets stand silently beside their aircraft, their breath visible in the morning air. Some of them know, deep down, that the planes they've been given are death traps. Yet orders are orders. They climb in, salute the ground crew, and roar down the runway toward the unknown. The engines cough, sputter, and protest, like beasts that never wanted to be awakened. Some barely lift off the ground. Others circle helplessly, struggling against the laws of aerodynamics themselves. The pilots can feel it, every vibration, every sluggish turn, a reminder that courage can't fix bad engineering. The contrast is heartbreaking. One side feels sleek, roaring killers of the sky, the other fragile tin birds that seem to belong to another era. In these moments, it's not just nations at war, it's ideas, resources, and the cruel mathematics of survival. This is not a story of glory, it's a story of desperation, of machines that never should have flown, and of the brave souls who tried to make them soar anyway. Tonight, we revisit the most pathetic fighter aircraft of World War II, the ones that looked like fighters but fought like ghosts. In the uncertain dawn of the Second World War, invention was not a luxury. It was a weapon. Every nation scrambled to design the next miracle machine that would command the skies. The problem was that dreams often flew faster than engines could. In the fever of competition, countries reached for brilliance and too often grabbed catastrophe. The men in the drafting rooms were hailed as visionaries, artists of metal and fire, and the pilots who would later fly their creations believed they were about to step into legends. But the truth hidden under gleaming coats of paint and national pride was that some of these machines were never meant to survive the reality of war. They were doomed before their first takeoff. In Italy, engineers at Fiat envisioned a sleek monoplane that would show the world that Mussolini's air force was not to be underestimated. The result was the Fiat G.50 Freccia, a machine that looked like progress but performed like a memory of the past. It had a clean fuselage, a modern retractable undercarriage, and a bubble canopy that gave pilots a good view of the chaos around them. But beneath the polished exterior lay the heart of a weak beast. Its engine was feeble, struggling to climb even when pushed to its limit. Against the British Hurricanes and Spitfires, it was a child among wolves. Italian pilots often found themselves climbing desperately while enemy fighters dove past them with contemptuous speed. What made it worse was its limited range, forcing pilots to fight with one eye always on the fuel gauge. Some planes never returned, not because of enemy bullets, but because they simply ran out of sky before they could find home. Pilots spoke of it with a kind of tired affection. They knew it wasn't the aircraft's fault. They respected its stubbornness. The Freccia would try its best, training its engine until it screamed. But no amount of courage could make it a champion. It was a symbol of Italy's misplaced confidence, of a nation trying to compete with giants on a foundation of sand. And yet for every pilot who cursed its slow climb, there was another who patted its wing and whispered gratitude for getting him back alive one more time. Across the channel in the factories of Britain, another idea was taking shape, an idea born from fear of the Luftwaffe and faith in novelty. The designers at Boulton Paul believed they had discovered the future of air combat. Their vision was the Defiant, a fighter with a power-operated turret mounted behind the pilot, armed with 4 and 3 machine guns. The concept was bold. Instead of diving straight at the enemy, the Defiant would fly alongside bombers or fighters, allowing the gunner to pivot his turret and shoot in any direction. It was elegant in theory, but war doesn't reward elegance. The plane had no forward-facing guns, which meant that in a head-on fight, it was defenseless. At first, German pilots were confused by it. They approached from behind, as they usually did, only to be shredded by the Defiant's rear turret fire. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the British had created a marvel. But the Luftwaffe learned quickly. Once they realized the Defiant had no frontal armament, they attacked it from head-on or from below, and the illusion shattered instantly. Squadrons that had tasted early success were suddenly being torn apart. Pilots watched helplessly as their gunner fired uselessly into empty sky, and their plane became a slow-moving target. Within weeks, the Defiant went from a supposed miracle to a flying coffin. The men who flew it didn't blame the engineers. They blamed the war. Britain had been desperate for ideas, and in desperation, imagination sometimes runs wild. But when imagination outruns practicality, men die for it. Still, there was a haunting beauty to the Defiant's failure. The turret gleamed in the sunlight as it rotated, elegant but futile, like a jewel in the sky. Those who survived spoke of the moments before combat, the silence in the cockpit, the creak of metal as the turret shifted, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, the enemy wouldn't know their weakness yet. These machines, the Fiat G.50, the Boulton Paul Defiant and others like them, were not born of stupidity but of arrogance disguised as optimism. In the late 1930s, air warfare was still new enough that no one truly understood its rules. Nations were experimenting with everything, from twin-tail designs to rear gunners, from pusher propellers to bizarre wing shapes. Some experiments succeeded, like the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt Bf 109, which became legends. But for every legend, there were a dozen failures, ghosts of ambition that never made it into the history books except as cautionary tales. France, for instance, fielded the Morane-Saulnier MS-406, a plane that looked elegant but fought like it belonged in another decade. It was underpowered, underarmed, and underprotected. When German fighters slashed through French skies, the MS-406 went down in flames, not because their pilots lacked courage, but because they were flying aircraft that couldn't climb, couldn't run, and could barely fight. French pilots often described their experience as a fighting with honor, but not with hope. These aircraft were reflections of their nations, proud, creative, but constrained by resources and time. War forces invention to sprint, but when it sprints too fast, it trips. The men in charge of design bureaus worked in frantic bursts, often given just months to turn sketches into machines that would decide lives. In hangars across Europe, engineers huddled under dim lamps, arguing over wing load ratios and fuel injection systems. Drafting tables were littered with crumpled blueprints, coffee cups, and silent prayers. They were artists sculpting in metal, but the canvas was unforgiving. Sometimes the ideas weren't wrong, they were just too early. The concept of a turret fighter like the Defiant might have worked decades later with better engines and radar targeting, but in the 1940s it was suicide. Likewise, Italy's monoplane designs could have been effective if given stronger power plants, but Italy's industry simply couldn't produce them fast enough or well enough. The result was a battlefield, littered with aircraft that represented human hope colliding with industrial limitation. Pilots, of course, had no choice. They took what they were given. There are stories of men returning from missions in their crippled planes, engines sputtering, control cables shot through, landing gear refusing to deploy. They would skid across the airfield, sparks flying, metal screaming, and crawl out of the wreckage with shaking hands. Then the next morning, they would be ordered into another one just like it. Some planes were so unreliable that ground crews named them with dark humor. The Widowmaker, the Floating Brick, the Iron Joke. In one account, an Italian pilot recalled looking at his Fiat G.50 before takeoff and murmuring a quiet apology to it. "You and I both know this isn't fair," he said. But let's try again." When he returned, the mechanics found bullet holes across the fuselage and oil leaking from the engine like blood. He patted its wing and whispered, "Good girl." It was a moment of strange tenderness between man and machine, born out of shared survival. In Britain, gunners in Defiance faced their own nightmares. Encased in glass domes, they had a near-perfect view of incoming death. Trapped in those turrets with no way to escape quickly, many died when their planes were hit. The pilot and gunner were locked in mutual fate. If one went down, both did. Survivors remembered the awful moments when the turret jammed mid-battle, leaving the gunner powerless. The sound of enemy machine guns ripping through aluminum echoed through the fuselage, followed by silence. The British would soon withdraw the Defiant from daytime service and use it as a night fighter, where its turret could at least aim in darkness. Even then, it was never truly safe. The lesson was brutal but clear. Innovation without adaptability is failure disguised as progress. Every rivet, every gauge, every screw in those aircraft carried the weight of a decision, a choice made in boardrooms and drafting halls far from the front lines, yet it was the pilots who paid for those choices. It's easy decades later to mock these machines, to call them pathetic, useless, or absurd, but in their own way they represent the raw human struggle to evolve in the face of destruction. War doesn't just build heroes, it builds lessons. The Fiat G.50 taught Italy that style could not replace strength. The Boulton Paul Defiant taught Britain that cleverness without practicality is suicide. The Moran Salnia taught France that courage without preparation is tragedy. When one walks through a modern air museum, the shiny restored fighters often steal the attention. The Spitfires, the Mustangs, the Messerschmitts, but in the shadowed corners where dust gathers and paint flakes from old aluminum skins, the true heart of the story lies. There you might find a Defiant, its turret frozen in place, or a G.50 missing its propeller, quietly rusting. They are silent now, but they speak in their own way, of dreams that flew too soon and of men who paid for those dreams with everything. As the war went on, technology advanced beyond them. New engines, better aerodynamics, radar and jet propulsion changed everything. But the ghosts of these early failures remained in the DNA of every later design. Each flaw corrected, each weakness understood, came from lessons written in blood. Without the Defiant, Britain might not have learned what true aerial versatility required. Without the G.50, Italy might never have realized how far behind it truly was. Without the MS-406, France might not have seen the urgent need for power over pride. They were the fragile stepping stones toward mastery of the sky. In that sense, perhaps they weren't pathetic at all, only tragic. Machines born too soon, fighting wars they weren't built to win. And behind every one of them stood a man who believed, even for a moment, that his plane could carry him home. When Hitler demanded weapons, machines that could turn the tide, engineers had no choice but to comply, even when their designs bordered on madness. The Heinkel E-162 Volkssieger, or a people's fighter, was one such creation. A jet fighter built in mere weeks, it was a marvel on paper. A fast, agile interceptor powered by a jet engine mounted on top of the fuselage. But the truth was tragic. It was built from plywood, assembled by untrained laborers, many of them teenagers or prisoners. The jet engine's heat often scorched the wooden body, and early prototypes exploded mid-flight. The cockpit instruments were so poorly fitted that some pilots used tape to hold them in place. The E-162 was supposed to save Germany, but instead it became a symbol of its collapse. Many of the young pilots assigned to it had less than 30 minutes of flight training before being thrown into combat. They were told that their speed would protect them. But speed means nothing if your wings shear off in a dive. Several E-162s disintegrated mid-air during test flights, their wooden joints unable to withstand the stress. The pilots never stood a chance. One German mechanic later said, "We built them like toys and watched them die like men." The desperation wasn't limited to new designs. Old aircraft were cannibalized for parts, repaired with plywood patches, and sent back into battle. Some German squadrons even experimented with ramming Allied bombers when their ammunition ran out. The skies over Europe became a graveyard of improvised engineering, where courage outlived common sense. And yet, even as the war closed in, innovation didn't stop. It simply lost its humanity. The Nazis pushed forward with suicidal designs like the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor that could reach incredible speeds but had barely 10 minutes of fuel. It launched like lightning, fired one burst at an enemy bomber, then glided helplessly to the ground, often crashing in the process. Pilots who flew it joked bitterly that they feared their own aircraft more than the enemy. The takeoff could kill you, the landing could kill you, and if neither did, the volatile rocket fuel likely would. By late 1944, the airfields of Europe were littered with corpses of dreams. Aircraft stood half-finished in bombed-out factories, their wings still raw with glue and nails. In one corner, a mechanic might be sanding plywood for a He-162. In another, a pilot might be practicing takeoffs in a simulator that barely worked. Children too young to vote were building aircraft too fragile to fight. Every crash, every fireball in the sky was another reminder that the war had turned human ingenuity into a form of collective madness. The Americans and British, for all their losses, had the luxury of learning from their mistakes. Their factories ran at full power, their engineers had resources, and their designs evolved safely. For Japan and Germany, however, innovation came from starvation. When there is nothing left but pride, pride becomes a weapon, and it kills almost as many as the enemy. In Japan, even the students in schools were taught to build model gliders for potential conversion into suicide planes. The dream of air superiority had become a cult of sacrifice. The imperial command spoke of honorable death, but the engineers saw only mathematics: aircraft that couldn't climb fast enough, bombs that were too small to matter, and pilots who would vanish before seeing a target. Some records show that late-war Japanese designers secretly tested ways to make their wooden aircraft survive at least 2 flights, but these efforts were dismissed as wasteful. Why build a plane that could land when landing was treason against destiny? Germany's last hope was efficiency through simplicity. The He-162 was supposed to be built in secret underground factories, away from Allied bombers. The workers, many of them slave laborers from concentration camps, toiled in darkness, their hands bleeding as they fitted wooden panels onto fragile fuselages. They were told that each finished jet could save the fatherland. But when those jets finally reached the airfields, many wouldn't even start. Pilots would sit in the cockpit, pressing the ignition switch over and over as mechanics banged on the engine casing with hammers, hoping to coax life from dying technology. It's easy now to look at these planes and laugh, to call them pathetic relics of failure. But in those years, they were symbols of nations gasping for air. Every bolt, every piece of sanded plywood represented one last attempt to rewrite fate. In a way, the Ki-115 and He-162 weren't mistakes. They were elegies, final notes in a song that was already ending. As the Allies swept across Europe and the Pacific, they captured many of these strange aircraft, often finding them abandoned in hangars or hidden in mountain tunnels. American pilots marveled at their crude construction. Some were amazed that they even flew at all. Wooden wings, glued seams, rusted bolts, yet these were the machines that desperate nations had once pinned their hopes on. Historians later debated whether these late war fighters could have changed anything if given more time or resources. The answer is almost always no. Their flaws were not in their design alone, but in their purpose. They were born not from strategy, but from fear, and fear builds fragile things. When the war finally ended, the ruins of these aircraft lay scattered across 2 continents. Children played among the wrecks of Heinkels and Nakajimas, unaware that the splintered wings beside them had once carried men to their deaths. The wind whistled through broken fuselages like ghosts whispering regrets. The factories that had built them were silent, and the men who designed them sat in quiet offices after the war, haunted by memories of blueprints that had become graves. The story of these planes is not just about engineering failure. It's about what happens when human beings run out of everything but hope, and how even hope, when twisted by desperation, can turn lethal. These aircraft, crude and tragic, marked the end of an era where courage alone could no longer conquer the skies. By the closing years of the Second World War, the skies above Europe and Asia were no longer theaters of glory. They were graveyards of smoke and twisted metal. The dreams of invincibility that had once filled the hangars of every nation were now reduced to wreckage scattered across fields, oceans, and ruined airstrips. In 1939, pilots took to the air believing they could shape history. By 1945, many climbed into their cockpits knowing that history had already shaped them. The airfighter, once a symbol of speed, skill, and supremacy, had become something else entirely. A desperate, fragile relic of human ambition. Some of these machines were already obsolete before they ever met an enemy, yet commanders sent them up again and again, asking them to perform miracles against the unstoppable. The Soviet Polikarpov I-16 was one of these ghosts, a stubby little monoplane that looked almost comical beside the sleek fighters of later years. When it first appeared in the mid-1930s, it was revolutionary. Fast, nimble, and modern, but war ages machines faster than time ever could. By the time the German Luftwaffe invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the I-16 was outclassed, outdated, and almost suicidal to fly in combat. Its short wings gave it a twitchy temperament, its cockpit was cramped, and its guns, though numerous, often jammed at high altitudes. Worse still, it had no armor. A single burst from a Messerschmitt could tear it apart like paper, and yet the Soviets kept sending them into battle. Entire squadrons of young pilots, barely trained, launched these aging relics into the sky against German aircraft that could outclimb, outgun, and outrun them with ease. The I-16s twisted through the air, agile but helpless, darting like insects around predators. Many Soviet pilots died before ever firing a shot, but a few, through sheer skill and fury, managed to score kills, proving that even a dying machine could still bite. Those rare victories became legends whispered in mess halls, stories meant to inspire courage amid chaos. Pilots spoke of diving headfirst into bomber formations, of skimming treetops to ambush unwary foes, of refusing to bail out until the very last breath. Their courage was endless, even if their planes weren't. Far to the west, France's 714 shared a similar fate. It was a fighter conceived in peace, built too lightly for war. Constructed from wood and fabric to save weight and cost, it looked fast and elegant, a greyhound among beasts, but appearances deceived. Its small engine barely gave it the strength to climb, and its delicate frame shuddered at high speeds. When the Battle of France erupted in 1940, the C-714 was thrown into the fray alongside a handful of desperate pilots, including brave volunteers from Poland who had escaped the fall of their homeland. They called themselves the Ghost Squadron, and their planes, weak, slow, and fragile, reflected that name perfectly. They fought with what they had. The Squadron struggled to gain altitude, often taking so long to climb that enemy bombers were already gone by the time they arrived. German Bf-109s could catch them easily, tearing through formations of the lightweight fighters with cruel precision. French commanders, horrified by the losses, ordered the aircraft withdrawn from service within weeks. Officially, they were declared unfit for combat, but the pilots didn't all listen. Some refused to abandon them. One Polish pilot famously said, "I would rather die fighting in a bad machine than live running from it," and many did. In their final missions, these planes became symbols of defiance. A C-714 couldn't match a Messerschmitt in speed, but it could still strike with fury when cornered. A few daring pilots used their maneuverability at low altitude to ambush German reconnaissance aircraft, snatching small victories amid certain defeat. When the French campaign ended, most squadrons were burned or captured. The surviving pilots mourned them like fallen comrades, not because they had been good machines, but because they had carried them, however briefly, into history. Across the seas, in the Pacific and Mediterranean, similar tragedies unfolded. Nations kept their oldest, weakest fighters airborne long past their time, not because they believed in them, but because they had no other choice. Every airfield became a museum of desperation, outdated biplanes beside half-finished prototypes, pilots patching holes with tin and wood, ground crews stealing parts from wrecks just to make one more sortie possible. By 1944, many of these planes weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting simply not to vanish unnoticed. But the skies had become merciless. Newer machines, faster, heavier, armored with steel, dominated every battle. The once proud relics of the early war years now crumbled before them like glass. The Soviet I-16s burned across the Eastern Front. The French squadrons and moraines were scattered ruins on European fields. Even Japan, whose engineers once built aircraft that ruled the Pacific, found itself reusing outdated Zeros against modern American Hellcats and Corsairs. The difference was night and day. Pilots who once soared in triumph now flew knowing that each takeoff might be their last. Behind every failing plane was a man, and behind every man a belief that his death would mean something. They knew their aircraft were pathetic by the standards of the time. They joked bitterly about them, cursed them, prayed over them. One Soviet pilot described his I-16 as a coffin with wings. Another said, "When I climb into it, I stop being afraid of the enemy. I'm too busy surviving the plane." And yet they kept flying, because in war, even the worst aircraft can still matter for one more mission, one more distraction, one more chance for someone else to live. As the Allies advanced, the wrecks of these outdated fighters became haunting reminders of the early days of the conflict. Crumpled aluminum and splintered wood littered the edges of runways. Cockpits were frozen in silence. Dials cracked, glass shattered, controls still grasped by skeletal hands. In the mud and snow of the Eastern Front, Soviet mechanics stripped engines from dead planes to power trucks and generators. Children played in their hollow shells, unaware that they were touching ghosts. When historians later tried to catalogue the aircraft of the war, they naturally focused on the legends: the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Bf-109. But hidden in the footnotes were these other machines: the I-16s, the Caudrons, the Brewsters, the Buffaloes, the Defiants, and dozens of others that never made it to the glossy pages of glory. They were remembered not for their victories, but for their failures, and perhaps that's what makes them so human. They remind us that progress is built on loss. Every great aircraft that soared in triumph stood upon the wreckage of another that never did. By 1945, many of these apathetic fighters had been reduced to training tools, decoys, or scrap. The Soviet Union used old I-16s as ground targets for gunnery practice. The French melted their Caudrons into parts for newer designs. In Japan, wooden aircraft were burned in bonfires to prevent their capture. Their brief lives ended not with dramatic explosions in the sky, but with quiet decay on forgotten airstrips. And yet, even in death, they left something behind. Not just wreckage, but stories. Stories of men who believed in their machines long after logic told them not to. Stories of engineers who cried over blueprints that had killed their pilots. Stories of hope that refused to die, even when wrapped in plywood and engine smoke. In one Soviet base after the war, a group of mechanics found an abandoned I-16, its wings riddled with bullet holes, its propeller bent. On the side of the fuselage, someone had written in chalk, "Still fighting." Left it there untouched. When winter came, the snow covered it completely, and when spring thawed the ground, it was gone, buried beneath the mud as if the earth itself had decided to give it rest. The same kind of quiet dignity surrounded the wrecks left in France. In meadows and forests, villagers would stumble upon the remains of Caudrons years after the war. They would see the faded tricolour roundels and wonder who had flown them. Sometimes they'd find personal belongings: a glove, a notebook, a photograph. The machines that had once seemed so inadequate had become monuments to courage. What made these aircraft pathetic was not their design alone, but the world that forced them to exist. They were born from poverty, from miscalculation, from war's cruel pace, but their pilots gave them purpose anyway. The I-16s that crashed defending Moscow, the Caudrons that fought hopelessly over Paris, the old Zeros that made last stands over Okinawa, they all belonged to the same tragic lineage. Machines that couldn't win, but refused to quit. And perhaps that's why they linger in memory more than the perfect ones. The mighty Spitfire, the elegant Mustang, the swift Bf-109, they inspire admiration. But the pathetic fighters, the fragile ghosts, inspire something deeper: pity, respect, a sense of shared mortality. They remind us that not all heroes are built to win. Some are built simply to try. When the last of these planes was scrapped, the sound of their engines faded into history, but their legacy lived on quietly in the lessons they taught. Nations learned that bravery could not compensate for neglect. Every future fighter that rose from the ashes, every MiG, every Sabre, every Phantom, carried within its frame a whisper of those forgotten failures. Today, when one stands before an old rusted fighter in a museum, its paint peeled, its propeller still, its body patched with scars, it's impossible not to feel something, not pride, not awe, because inside that cockpit once sat a human being who faced death not with the best tools, but with the only ones he had. And for that alone, even the most pathetic fighter of the Second World War deserves to be remembered.